She laughed. Right there, on national television. Cori Bush laughed as J.D. Vance stood in silence, reading the names of 27 forgotten towns. But behind that laugh was something more dangerous than arrogance. It was a lie that buried the stories of 30 million American workers who lost everything: jobs, homes, hope, while no one in Washington dared speak their names. J.D. Vance did. He didn't slam his fist. He didn't shout. He simply opened a folder, looked into the camera, and said, "If they don't matter, then who does?" And in that instant, the noise died. The room stopped breathing because someone finally had the courage to say it out loud. Now here's the question. Do you? Do you have the courage to say what he did when it mattered most? The story you're about to hear didn't happen exactly this way, but it could have. The names may be symbols, the towns, composites, yet every emotion, every silence, every truth beneath the surface, those are borrowed from real lives, real losses, and the America we sometimes forget to look at. This isn't just a story, it's a reminder, and maybe a voice, for those still waiting to be heard. Stay with us. Not because it's easy to hear, but because someone, somewhere, is still living this story. The lights were bright, brighter than they needed to be. A ring of cameras lined the back wall like watchful eyes, unblinking, waiting to catch one viral moment. The Senate Subcommittee on Economic Accountability had been running for over 3 hours, but everyone knew the real show was just beginning. At the long, curved table sat J.D. Vance, hands folded, chin slightly down. His tie was loose at the collar, not from laziness, but defiance. Before him sat a folder, thin, unlabeled, but weighted somehow, as if it carried names instead of numbers. Across the aisle, Congresswoman Cori Bush leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, smirking before her mic turned red. "Let's not pretend this hearing isn't what it really is," she began, her voice smooth, practiced. The voice of someone who knew the cameras were rolling. "We're here debating the Save Our Towns Act, a piece of performative theater dressed up as legislation designed to pander to rural voters who lost their factories. What, 30 years ago?" A ripple of laughter rolled through the chamber, not just from her side of the aisle, but from staffers, aides, even a few journalists off camera. The kind of laughter that says, "He doesn't belong here." J.D. didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He didn't even look at her. He looked down, not in shame, but in restraint. Cori went on. "We're wasting taxpayer dollars to relive a Rust Belt sob story. Meanwhile, actual people, living in real-time communities, are being left behind today." Another chuckle. A hand clapped faintly in the press gallery. Then came the line. She leaned forward slightly, cocking her head with a sarcastic smile. "I mean, what's next, Senator Vance? A memorial for Blockbuster Video?" This time the room broke. Laughter louder now. Some of it surprised, some mean-spirited, all of it echoing. The moment was already being clipped, subtitled, sent out into the bloodstream of Twitter and TikTok. Cori knew it. She sat back, satisfied. Her gaze swept the room like a performer landing a punchline. And still, J.D. said nothing. But his silence wasn't weakness. It was control. The camera, the main CSPAN feed, zoomed in on him, slowly. His fingers were pressed gently together, elbows on the table, body motionless. And his eyes, they rose slowly and locked onto Cori's. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He just looked at her with the kind of gaze that doesn't scream back, but remembers. There was no soundbite to grab, no fiery comeback, no chair-slamming response, only stillness. Only that look. It made people uncomfortable. It made a few stop laughing, because it wasn't political. It was personal. Somewhere in the back row, a young aide whispered to a colleague, "Why isn't he saying anything?" The colleague replied, "I think he's letting her finish." The chair called for order, moved the discussion forward. But J.D. didn't move his hands, didn't reach for his mic. Not yet. Outside, reporters were already tweeting, "Cori Bush destroys J.D. Vance on live TV." Senator Vance roasted for his ghost town bill. Did JD forget to show up today? But inside that room, something had shifted. It was hard to name, but undeniable, because sometimes the most dangerous man in the room is the one who doesn't speak right away. And the folder in front of JD, still unopened, but when it did open, the entire country would stop laughing. The laughter was still echoing in his ears, not because he cared about the joke, but because he knew how loud silence felt when it followed pain. J.D. Vance stepped through the side door of the Senate chamber, past the thick velvet curtain, into the back corridor of the Capitol. The marble floor muted his steps, but the volume of the television was unmistakable. In the green room, one aide had already queued up the playback. The screen showed Cori Bush, smiling like she had just won a game show, delivering the now viral line, "What's next, Senator Vance? A memorial for Blockbuster Video?" Another aide muttered, "Already has 2 million views on Twitter, trending next to AI weapons," and Taylor Swift's new album. JD didn't look at the screen. He stood just inside the room, shoulders square but face unreadable, the way a soldier stands before a closed casket. His senior staffer, Nolan, approached with cautious optimism. "You want to go back on? Clean it up before the 6 o'clock cycle?" JD finally moved, just his head shaking gently. "No, we'll answer in a language she can't dismiss." Nolan blinked. "Which language is that?" JD looked up at him. Not with anger, not with smugness, but with something colder, clarity. "Names." There was no fanfare, no command. He simply walked out of the room, leaving the laughter and the looping clip behind. 10 minutes later, they were back in his office. The small one, not the camera-ready suite. The room looked more like a school administrator's closet. A crooked flag, mismatched chairs, and one ancient filing cabinet in the corner covered in dust. JD walked over to it. He didn't ask anyone to follow. He just opened the bottom drawer. It groaned with weight, like something long buried had just remembered how to breathe. Inside were hundreds of letters, yellowed envelopes, folded legal pads, hand-signed notes, some written in all caps, others with perfect cursive, none of them recent. Nolan entered behind him. "What are those?" JD didn't look up. He picked one up, held it to the light. The ink had smudged from age, but the words were still legible. "Our last grocery store closed this year. Our boys are driving trucks to Kentucky for work. This town built steel for 50 years. Now we can't get a bus line. Mayor Carla Jensen, Lisbon, Ohio." JD placed it gently on his desk, then pulled out another. "We sent 5 letters to Washington, got 1 auto reply, and then they took our post office." And another. "My husband served 2 tours, came back to nothing. He's working night shifts at Dollar General. You think we don't see the votes that never make it to the floor?" He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Slowly, methodically, he walked to the far wall. Bare drywall stained from where old posters had once hung. He picked up a roll of tape and began tacking the letters up, one by one. Town name facing out, creases visible, edges curling, Lisbon, Ruston, Parkersburg, Ashland, Marion, Belleville. By the time he placed the 7th letter, Nolan spoke again, this time quieter. "You're making a map, aren't you?" JD nodded once. "No one cares about statistics, but everyone remembers a name." He kept pinning. The light from the window began to fade and the room took on a golden hue. Soft, tired, like the towns in those envelopes. JD didn't ask for help. He just kept going. Outside, the headlines were still laughing. But inside, something had shifted. And the wall was only just beginning. The wall filled quickly. Letters, tape, towns, names that no longer made the evening news but once printed paychecks by the thousands. J.D. Vance stood before the fading paint of his office wall as if standing before a monument only he could see. Behind him, a staffer rolled out a large laminated map of the United States. Blank, clean, too clean. J.D. unrolled it over the conference table, weighing down the corners with coffee mugs and paperweights. Then he pulled out a small container filled with red push pins. The pins weren't marked or labeled, just red plastic tips and steel points. But each one meant something. Each one stood for loss. He started with Ohio, one in Chillicothe, one in Mansfield, another in Steubenville, then Michigan, Flint, of course, then Indiana, Pennsylvania, West Virginia. The pins came faster than expected. It didn't feel like a statement. It felt like confession. By the time he'd finished an hour later, the Midwest looked wounded. Tiny red dots scattered like old scars on worn skin. He stepped back, arms crossed. Silence. Looks like a war map, Nolan muttered behind him. JD didn't reply. He didn't have to. Because in his mind, that's exactly what it was. 2 days later, JD stood outside a shuttered paper mill in Chillicothe, Ohio. Cold wind rolled through the skeletal parking lot, where grass now grew through concrete seams. He could still smell pulp in the air, a scent that lingered even though the machines hadn't moved in over a decade. The town hadn't died, but it hadn't thrived either. On a rusted bench across from the mill sat Bill Tanner, a former union steward with oil-stained hands and a jaw like a brick wall. He didn't rise when JD approached, just nodded once in recognition, more out of habit than warmth. "Didn't think we'd see another senator out here," Bill said flatly, lighting a cigarette. "Last one came for votes, not answers." JD sat beside him. "I'm not here for votes." Bill exhaled slow. "Good, 'cause we ran out of those too." They watched the mill together for a while, just watched it, as if it might come alive again if someone stared long enough. The windows were busted. The chain-link fence sagged. The company sign still hung, but the paint had faded to bone gray. "You remember the day they shut it down?" JD asked. Bill nodded. "Got a text at 6:13 a.m. Said not to come in. Just like that. 42 years, and I got a text." A long pause. "They told us to retrain," Bill added bitterly. "Said we could drive Ubers. Hell, there ain't even Uber out here. Closest thing we got is a guy named Randy who owns a van." JD smiled faintly. Not from humor, but from the tragedy of how true it sounded. Bill took another drag, then flicked the ash to the ground. "They never laughed when it was Wall Street," he muttered. "Not once. Not on TV. Not on Twitter. When the banks crashed, they threw 'em a rope. But when we collapsed, they gave us jokes." JD didn't answer right away. He looked at the mill again, then at the sidewalk where two weeds pushed through cracked pavement. "That's why I'm not laughing either," he said quietly. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was shared. Two men, one town, a memory of something bigger than either of them, and the faint, unfinished shape of something that still might return. As JD pinned the final red dot on the map, a deeper memory surfaced, one that no headline could capture. Long before the cameras, before the Capitol halls, it all began at a quiet dinner table in Dayton. The smell of canned green beans lingered longer than it should have. The kind of scent that filled a room not because it was rich, but because it had nowhere else to go. The house was quiet, not out of peace, but shock. The Vance family didn't talk much during dinner, even on good days, but this wasn't a good day. This was the day Uncle Ray came home early, shoulders sagging, shirt untucked, still wearing his steel-toe boots like he hadn't figured out what to do without them yet. He sat at the head of the table without speaking, and Aunt Linda placed a plate in front of him like muscle memory. No one asked him what happened. They already knew. GM had closed. The plant, the line, the jobs, gone. All that remained was the cold spaghetti, the thin cornbread, and the silence between bites. JD, just 14 then, sat between his younger cousin and the broken window that had been duct-taped last winter but never fully sealed. The wind slipped through it anyway, the kind that didn't chill your skin, just your spine. He watched his uncle push peas around his plate like a man trying to remember what food was for. The television in the living room was on mute, flashing a headline. "Markets bounce back." That felt like a joke. Finally, Aunt Linda broke the stillness. Not with a fork clatter, not with a sigh, but with a sentence that didn't ask permission. "We don't count unless we riot." JD looked up. His aunt's voice wasn't angry. It was flat, like it had calcified over years of seeing neighbors laid off, churches boarded up, and handshakes replaced with pink slips. Uncle Ray didn't argue. He just nodded slightly, then cut into his meatloaf like it had personally betrayed him. Across the table, JD's cousin asked in a small voice. What's a riot? Nobody answered. JD lowered his head and pulled the little spiral notebook from his pocket, the one he usually used to scribble down new words or poems he was too embarrassed to say out loud. But that night, he wrote something different. Not for school, not for show. We matter even when we're quiet. He didn't know if it was true. He just needed it to be. That sentence stayed with him longer than algebra. Longer than locker combinations. Longer than crushes or video games or even homecomings. It was the first time he understood what it meant to watch dignity leak from a room, quietly, invisibly, and realize no one was coming to patch the hole. Uncle Ray got another job 6 months later, at a tire shop 2 counties over, paid in cash, no benefits. Aunt Linda started cleaning houses on the weekends. JD's cousin dropped out at 17 to help. No one called it a crisis. They just called it Dayton. And the funny thing? No one threw a rock. No one held a sign. There were no flames, no speeches, no news cameras asking how they felt. They didn't riot, so no one noticed them go. Years later, JD would sit in Senate hearings and watch colleagues twist statistics like balloon animals, wage recovery percentages, unemployment graphs, economic optimism indices. He'd think about that dinner table, the peas that didn't move, the duct-taped window, the muted screen. They weren't on any chart, but they were real. And that notebook, the one with the scribbled truth in faded ink, still sat in the top drawer of his desk, unopened, but never forgotten. Because some truths don't shout. They just wait for someone to say them out loud. The clip hit the internet before J.D. Vance even stepped out of the building. By the time his car pulled away from Capitol Hill, the Cori Bush blockbuster moment had already gone viral. 28 seconds of political theater, trimmed, subtitled, and uploaded from 5 angles, now lived in every feed and inbox from D.C. to Des Moines. The media didn't just report it, they celebrated it. Cable anchors called it another firebrand zinger from the congresswoman who knows how to own a room. Commentators laughed as they replayed the footage in slow motion, circling JD's still face, then cutting to Cori's smirk. A Chiron on one network read, Bush roasts Vance for Rust Belt fantasy bill. Late-night hosts joined in. One quipped, J.D. Vance wants to save ghost towns. Someone tell him he's not Casper. The audience howled. By morning, Twitter had weaponized the moment. Hashtag Hillbilly Stunt climbed to the top of the trending list, followed closely by hashtag JD the Actor, hashtag Senator Silence, and hashtag Cori Snaps Back. Edited reaction GIFs flooded the replies, JD looking stunned, overlaid with cartoon stars and fake tears. One meme paired Cori's face with the words, Your town's not coming back. Get Wi-Fi instead. Inside JD's office, the mood was brittle. The aides had gone quiet. Phones buzzed with notifications they stopped checking. The whiteboard in the hallway that once listed talking points had been wiped clean. One junior staffer broke the silence. Should we say something? Clarify the numbers in the bill? Reframe the intent? No one answered. Across the room, Nolan closed his laptop and sighed. Feels like they turned him into a punchline overnight. The clip's already got 6 million views. JD stood by the window, hands in his pockets, eyes on nothing. Another staffer hesitated before asking, Are we retreating? JD turned, not quickly but deliberately. No, he said, voice even. A pause. Then what are we doing? Someone asked. JD looked at the map, the one with the red pins, the one they thought he'd started as a symbolic gesture, but it wasn't symbolic to him. We're listening. That was it. No press conference, no tweet, no fiery response. Just that. He walked to his desk, picked up another letter from the drawer, folded, worn, no return address. He didn't read it aloud. He didn't need to. Because while the internet laughed, the wall behind him grew. One letter at a time, he pinned another, and another, and another. Outside, the circus kept spinning. Cori Bush did 3 interviews in 2 days. One with MSNBC, one on NPR, and one with a lifestyle YouTube channel titled Power, Politics, and Lipstick. In each, she doubled down saying, I won't apologize for calling out nostalgia politics. This isn't about saving abandoned factories. It's about moving forward. The applause was immediate. Her base loved it, but something strange happened around the edges. Quiet things. A local AM station in Ohio read one of the letters JD had pinned. A retired steelworker from Indiana called into C-SPAN and said, "At least he didn't laugh." In the comments section beneath the trending video, a user named MilltownMom43 wrote, "Funny how everyone's laughing. I lived in one of those towns. We weren't actors. We were just forgotten." It didn't go viral, but it stayed up, and that was enough for JD. Because he wasn't chasing the algorithm, he was chasing memory. And memory doesn't always trend. It waits until someone decides to answer it by name. The map was never supposed to be permanent. At first, it had simply been a way to see the pain, a visual anchor to the letters J.D. Vance had carried for years, like ghost stories folded into envelopes. But after the clip of Cori Bush's laughter saturated the internet, the letters didn't stop. They multiplied. By the end of the week, the office had received over 900 new messages, handwritten, emailed, voice recorded, even scribbled on the backs of gas receipts. Some came from mayors, others from high school civics teachers, a few from veterans who hadn't spoken publicly in decades. The pins ran out by Tuesday. Nolan walked into JD's office with a new box from the stationery store, color-coded this time. "Red for towns that lost factories," he said. "Blue for post office closures. Green for hospitals. Black for suicides. Gold. We only got 10 of those." JD raised an eyebrow. "Gold's for the ones that shouldn't be forgotten." "Ever," Nolan added quietly. They got to work. It wasn't loud. There were no camera crews, no hashtags, no microphones. Just 4 staffers with laptops, maps, tape, and hands that grew steadier with every letter they unfolded. By now, the map had extended from the back wall across the conference room and onto the hallway, so that every visitor, even the skeptical ones, had to walk past pain made visible. On Wednesday, a quiet young intern named May approached JD with a stack of printouts. "Michigan's getting a flood," she said, "especially from Genesee County." JD sat beside her at the sorting table. The letters were arranged by ZIP code, then time-stamped. One was written in careful blue ink on lined notebook paper. He read it silently, then read it again. "My plant closed 12 years ago. My daughter's never seen it. She asked me this morning if we're invisible. I told her no, but I didn't believe it when I said it. Marcia B., Flint, Michigan." JD held the letter for a moment longer than usual. Then without a word, he reached into the new box and pulled out one of the 10 gold pins. He pressed it firmly into the Michigan corner of the map. Someone behind him asked, "What made you choose that one?" He didn't turn. "This one speaks for 20,000. There was no applause, just the soft clicking of more pins going into more towns. The map began to take on a life of its own. It was no longer a collage. It had become a cartography of neglect, a living record of how deeply a nation could forget itself. Aide after aide began spending their lunch breaks reading the letters. Some cried, some went silent. One admitted he hadn't known places like Ansted, West Virginia, or Olney, Illinois still existed, let alone that they'd been sending letters for years that no one read. The hallway grew crowded with pin clusters. JD's office resembled something between a war room and a memorial. A few senators passed by and peeked in. Most didn't say anything, but one quietly whispered, "I thought we were done hearing from these people." JD replied without flinching, "No, you just stopped listening." At night, when the office emptied and the map sat alone, JD would sometimes stand in front of it like a preacher in a silent chapel. His hand would hover over a letter, not to pin it, but to remember it, because something had shifted, not on the news, not online, but here, in this room, in the slow, deliberate act of answering history with names. And the map? It wasn't just growing anymore. It was learning how to bite. The envelope was smaller than the others. No return address, no stamp. Just his name, written in fading blue ink across the front. Senator J.D. Vance. It had arrived in a stack of 23 letters that morning, most typed, some printed, a few scribbled hastily on the backs of discarded forms. But this one stood out. It looked like something you'd tuck into a Bible or slide under a door when words were too fragile to say out loud. JD held it in his hand for a long moment before opening it. The paper inside was lined, folded twice, and creased down the center from what must have been weeks, if not months, in someone's purse. It began simply, "Dear Senator Vance, my name is Marlene, and I live just outside Athens, Ohio. You've never met me, and I don't expect you ever will. That's fine. I'm not writing for a favor. I'm writing because I watched what happened on the news last week," the part where she laughed. JD's fingers tightened slightly on the page. "I've heard that laugh before. I've heard it in my own kitchen. My son Lucas worked at the paper mill in town for 9 years. When it shut down, they told him to reskill. He tried. Applied for a warehouse job 40 miles away. They wanted someone with experience. He took a night job at a gas station instead. He started taking pills to stay awake, then to sleep, then to make the silence hurt less. He died in our garage last November. We found him with the radio on. It was tuned to the same news station that never once mentioned our town's name." JD swallowed. The room was still. "I'm not writing to blame anyone. Blame is heavy, and I've carried enough already. I'm writing because when I saw you sit still, when you didn't clap back, didn't perform, I saw someone who didn't forget how to sit with grief. And that's rare in Washington. We don't need a check, just someone to say our name. There was no signature, just that final line, written a little darker than the rest, like the pen had pressed deeper into the paper." JD read it again, and then again. Outside the office window, DC moved on as usual. Horns, headlines, helicopters. Another cycle, another soundbite. Inside, JD folded the letter carefully, not like a document, but like a photograph. He pulled out his phone. No video, no caption, no commentary, just a single photo. The letter unfolded on his desk, words visible in the afternoon light. He posted it, no hashtags, no statement, just silence. Within hours it had spread, not like wildfire, but like a whisper passed in a church pew. People didn't quote it, they didn't remix it, they just shared it. Quietly, thoughtfully, from inbox to inbox, from one forgotten town to another. By the next morning, a truck driver in Kentucky had printed it out and taped it to the inside of his rig. A librarian in Iowa posted it on a community board beside a list of overdue books. A retired school teacher in West Virginia used it as a writing prompt in her GED class. Write the name you want the country to remember. No one asked JD for context. They didn't need to, because Marlene had written the part that mattered. And JD? He was still holding the envelope, running his thumb along the edge like a reminder. Not of strategy, not of politics, but of why silence can sometimes be louder than applause. No one had put it on the schedule. There were no invites, no embargoed statements, no bold font press advisory from JD Vance's office. Just a time, 11 a.m., and a location, a small federal conference room on the second floor of the Capitol, the kind usually reserved for procedural updates or dry committee overviews. The media showed up out of habit, not urgency. Most were still buzzing from Cori Bush's third TV segment of the week. Her numbers were up. Her campaign was energized. JD, on the other hand, had said little. Too little. To some, it looked like he was fading. At 11:03, the door opened. JD stepped in alone. No podium, no staffers, no stack of policy binders. Just a folded piece of paper in his hand, and that same quiet, unreadable look he wore the day the chamber laughed at him. The reporters straightened slightly, waiting for him to begin. He didn't greet them. He just unfolded the paper and began reading. Nelsonville, Ohio, 412 jobs lost. Paducah, Kentucky, 720 jobs. Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, 1,100 jobs. Elwood, Indiana, 589. Bastrop, Louisiana, 344. No intro, no commentary. Hazard, Kentucky, 230. Marion, Illinois, 913. Rock Springs, Wyoming, 267. Crossett, Arkansas, 603. Messina, New York, 376. One reporter began to whisper to another. Another checked their phone. The names didn't mean much to them, not yet. Decatur, Alabama, 782. Escanaba, Michigan, 411. Beloit, Wisconsin, 598. Toccoa, Georgia, 205. Logan, West Virginia, 1122. By the 12th name, the room had grown uncomfortable. Not angry, not bored, uncertain. JD looked up, slowly, calmly. A reporter cleared her throat. Senator, with all due respect, what exactly is this? Another chimed in. Is this a campaign stunt? A rollout of some bill? JD didn't flinch. He didn't look at them. He looked directly into the camera lens positioned at the back of the room. No, it's a memorial. Silence. He folded the paper carefully and placed it in front of him on the table. I know this isn't the kind of speech that gets clicks, he continued, tone flat but unwavering. There's no applause line, no outrage soundbite, just names, towns, numbers that used to mean families, mortgages, baseball games, grocery store runs. He let that hang in the air, then added softly, they're not on the news anymore. But they were real. That was it. No Q&A. He stood and left without a wave, without a smile, without any staffers scrambling behind him. The reporters sat for a beat longer than usual, unsure if they were supposed to be filming or forgetting. The clip aired on just one local station that night, a grainy CSPAN snippet, tucked between weather and a tax policy update. Major outlets didn't bite, too flat, too quiet. But online, something different happened. Someone uploaded the clip under the title, He Just Read the Names. It had no hashtags, no music, no overlays, just the raw footage. Within 12 hours, it had 900,000 views. By the second day, 3 million. No boost, no promotion, just a slow, steady rhythm of people sharing it with a line. My uncle worked in one of those towns. Or, this is the first time I've heard my city mentioned since the plant closed. There were no trending hashtags, but there were bookmarks and quiet tears, because for once, someone had stood in front of the cameras and said less, so the country could feel more. The bell rang, but no one moved. The overhead lights hummed, flickering slightly in the back of room 203 at Park Valley High, a small-town public school tucked into the wooded corners of southern Missouri. Fluorescent and faded, the room had a sagging ceiling tile near the projector screen and posters curling off the walls. The Constitution lives here. Think before you speak. History is a mirror. Mr. Reynolds, a civics teacher with gray at the temples and a stack of ungraded essays on his desk, stood at the front, remote in hand, pausing the video just as J.D. Vance looked into the camera and said, "No, it's a memorial." The silence that followed was unexpected. Not the fidgety kind that usually came after a dry political clip, but a stillness thick enough to feel. 17 juniors sat in their chairs, some with notebooks half open, others frozen with their pens midair. The clip hadn't come with music or graphics. No flashy overlays, just a man reading names. One after the next, and yet somehow it had cut through the static like a blade. Near the window, a girl in a faded sweatshirt leaned forward, barely above a whisper. He said our town. The words floated in the air, unchallenged. Reynolds looked up. You sure? She nodded slowly. Logan County. He said, Logan, West Virginia, 1122. My dad's from there. My grandma still lives in a trailer behind the old mining road. The boy beside her added, Mine too. My uncle used to work in the sawmill before it shut. Another student raised his hand halfway, then lowered it. Did he say Marion? That's where my cousin's from. Reynolds didn't answer. He walked over to the whiteboard and uncapped a black marker. His hand hovered a moment before writing a single sentence in block letters. Recognition is resistance. He underlined it once. That's what this is about, he said. Not politics, not points on a poll, but this, when someone says your town's name out loud, and suddenly what you lived through becomes history, not just memory. He looked around. How many of you have heard your town mentioned on the news in the past year? No hands went up. How many of you have seen a national politician visit here in your lifetime? Still none. A few eyes dropped to the floor. One student twisted his pencil until it snapped. And how many of you have family members who've worked jobs that don't exist here anymore? Almost every hand rose. Reynolds clicked the projector off. The screen retracted with a soft, mechanical whir. Most politicians talk about the future like it's a place they already own, he said. But J.D. Vance didn't do that. He read the past out loud, the kind most people want us to forget. He walked back to his desk and picked up a stack of printouts. I want you to write something this week. Nothing formal, no citations. Just this. Write about a moment when your family felt unseen, a job lost, a name erased, a story nobody asked to hear. He handed out the pages, each one printed with the transcript of J.D.'s speech, but this time with blank margins. For your notes, he said, or your thoughts. The bell rang again. Still no one moved. Because for the first time in a long time, they didn't feel like background noise. They felt like part of the story. And as they filed out, slowly and quietly, one girl paused at the whiteboard and looked at the words again. Recognition is resistance. She whispered it once to herself, like something she wasn't ready to forget. The audience laughed before she even finished the sentence. Bright lights, polished floors, 4 hosts in pastel blazers circling the table like seasoned sparring partners. And in the center, Congresswoman Cori Bush, grinning behind the coffee mug that read unapologetic. She was the guest of the morning on The View, a slot often reserved for rising stars, scandal survivors, or headline generators. Today, she was all three. The segment had barely started before the host brought it up. The now famous clip of J.D. Vance reading town names into a Senate camera. One of the co-hosts played a short montage. J.D.'s quiet recitation, the phrase "it's a memorial," followed by the original viral laughter from the chamber days earlier. The screen cut back to Cori, who tilted her head and smirked. "Oh, come on," she said, her voice light but loaded. "We're calling that a policy proposal now?" The audience chuckled. Another host asked, "You don't think he struck a chord with people?" Cori leaned forward, elbows on the table. "I think he struck a chord with people who miss VHS tapes. If shouting out ghost towns is how we legislate now, maybe we should just elect Google Maps." That line landed. The crowd roared. Claps, whistles, someone even shouted, "Say that again," from the back row. Cori sat back, pleased. The hosts smiled knowingly. The segment continued with laughter and head shakes. J.D. Vance painted as an irrelevant nostalgia merchant, a voice for a vanished America clinging to ruins. Online, the soundbite went up within minutes. Clips circulated with titles like "Cori Bush obliterates J.D. Vance in 11 seconds" and "TikTok populism versus real policy." The quote about Google Maps became a trending TikTok audio, used by creators stitching photos of ghost towns and abandoned Walmarts, often ending with a sarcastic, "Thanks, J.D." And yet, something shifted beneath the noise. It wasn't loud, it wasn't organized, but it was there. In a Facebook group for former factory workers in West Virginia, a post read, "She thinks this is funny. My brother died waiting for his job to come back." On Reddit, in a small-town subreddit few outside Ohio visited, one user wrote, "I'm tired of our pain being someone else's punchline." Even on Twitter, land of sarcasm and speed, a few cracks in the consensus appeared. "He read my town's name. She laughed. That's all I needed to see." J.D. Vance may not have all the answers, but Cori Bush sure as hell didn't ask the right questions. J.D.'s office said nothing. No statement, no tweet, no follow-up video. But the map on the wall? It grew. A dozen new letters came in that evening, one from a retired coal worker, another from a middle school principal, a third from a former Marine who simply wrote, "They closed my VA center. You can pin me in black." The gold pins remained untouched. J.D. read each note silently. Nolan leaned into the doorway, a tablet in hand. "You see Cori's latest?" J.D. shook his head. "She called you a TikTok populist." A faint smile tugged at J.D.'s mouth, but not in amusement. "She's not wrong," he said. "It's just that she's confusing popularity with presence." Outside the Capitol, the cameras turned to other stories. New scandals, new viral flare-ups. But beneath the surface, in lunchrooms, garages, and living rooms across forgotten towns, Something older than applause was beginning to take root. It wasn't rage, it wasn't pity, it was recognition. And once people are seen, they don't unsee themselves so easily. It wasn't supposed to go public. The email was part of an internal thread. Strategy notes between mid-level staffers for a coastal campaign group. The kind of chatter that happens behind closed inboxes, never meant to see daylight. But someone screenshotted it, and within hours the message was out in the open. Black text on white background, circulating with the subtle fury of a lit match in dry grass. Let JD bury himself in white nostalgia. The more he romanticizes these broken towns, the easier it'll be to define him as irrelevant. The screenshot hit Twitter first, then Reddit, then political blogs hungry for a headline. By mid-morning it had reached the desks of JD's staff. Nolan was the first to read it aloud. JD sat still, glancing at the copy printed in front of him. No surprise in his face, just a slow blink, the kind a boxer makes before the second round. "Want a comment?" Nolan asked. JD didn't answer. He stood, walked to the back room of the office, the one with the map still covered in pins, the letters still curling on the wall. A single camera had been set up in the corner for the occasional live stream. It hadn't been used in weeks. This time, there would be no music, no graphics, no intro roll. Just him. He sat down in front of the lens. No notes, no teleprompter. The lighting was uneven, shadows pooling behind him, giving the whole frame a worn, documentary feel. When the red light came on, JD looked into the lens and started. "They're calling it nostalgia." Pause, breath. "They say I'm romanticizing places that don't matter anymore, that by remembering them, I'm somehow holding the country back. But let me ask you something." His voice stayed low, measured, but every syllable landed like a slow hammer. "If we forget these towns, who are we remembering?" Cut. That was it. No hashtags, no slogan. Just a single-line caption beneath the video when it posted an hour later. You don't have to shout to be heard. Sometimes you just have to mean it. The video didn't trend immediately. It was too slow for Twitter's chaos, too quiet for cable, but it started showing up in group texts, church Facebook pages, local union listservs. In a veterans forum, one user wrote, "I haven't cried in 20 years. That question got me." A community theater group in Indiana projected the video behind them as a backdrop for their memorial play about factory closings. On YouTube, a teacher clipped the line and titled it, "The Most Important Political Question in a Decade." And in one diner in Portsmouth, Ohio, a waitress paused mid-shift to replay it on her phone. "If we forget these towns, who are we remembering?" She repeated out loud, like a prayer she hadn't known she needed. JD didn't check the analytics. He didn't refresh the likes. He went back to the letters. 3 more had come in since lunch. One from a janitor, one from a preacher, one from a single mother who wrote, "We're not longing for the past. We're grieving what no one admitted we lost." That night, JD passed by the glowing Capitol building on his walk home. Reporters were camped outside, waiting for someone else. A different scandal, a different soundbite. He kept walking. Because when you stop chasing the camera, sometimes the camera starts chasing you. And now, without raising his voice, J.D. Vance had asked a question America couldn't quite shake. The post came from a retired Marine in Tennessee. No profile picture, no bio. Just a name, a flag, and the kind of plain-spoken clarity that didn't ask for attention, but got it anyway. "Bush mocked my brother's town. Vance remembered it." That's the difference. It didn't go viral in the traditional sense. No trending tab, no flash edit graphics. But it got shared and then reshared, like a ripple passing through places where ripples usually died quietly. By the end of the day, JD's video, the one where he simply asked, "If we forget these towns, who are we remembering?" had spread far beyond the Beltway. The analytics weren't driven by bots or influencers. They were driven by memory. A school nurse in Kansas posted it with the caption, "He said my father's hometown. We used to go fishing behind the mill before it closed." A grain farmer in Nebraska stitched the clip onto a video of his empty grain elevator. He didn't say a word. He just looked at the camera, then panned to a rusted sign that read, "Closed until further notice. Established, 1946. In the comments, people began tagging each other. Didn't your mom work in Marion? Wasn't Grandpa from Ashland? I think this guy's talking about us. Someone remixed JD's video into a short TikTok. It opened with drone footage of broken glass windows in an old warehouse, then cut to JD's question, if we forget these towns, before a slow fade in, pictures of old school yearbooks, factory clocks stuck at 5:17, American flags draped over empty front porches. The voiceover in the remix didn't sound like a politician. It sounded like a neighbor. He's not just reading names, he's returning dignity. And that was the word that stuck. Dignity. It was the opposite of laughter. It wasn't anger. It wasn't spectacle. It didn't trend. It traveled. Back in JD's office, staffers noticed the shift. The tone of incoming messages was changing. Fewer statistics, more stories. More people. A former coal miner from West Virginia wrote, "My grandfather dug through rock with his hands. The day he died, the state didn't even send a flag, but you said our county. That meant something." A single-line email from a woman in Oklahoma simply read, "I'm 72. I never thought I'd see someone say our name on TV." The map in JD's office had to be extended. Again. Now it reached across the opposite wall, pins clustering in the Midwest and stretching down into the Deep South. Staffers began placing yellow sticky notes beside gold pins with the names of people who had written twice, as if refusing to be missed a second time. Nolan walked into JD's office with his laptop. "You need to see this," he said. He hit play on a grassroots video someone had posted. No budget, no graphics, just a father and son standing outside an abandoned high school in Iowa. The father held up a faded photo of the town's old football team. The boy held up JD's quote, printed in Sharpie on cardboard. JD watched in silence. "They're not campaigning," Nolan said softly. JD looked up. "No, they're testifying." Outside, the headlines had already moved on to a new scandal, a new fire to chase. But inside homes, churches, and VFW halls, people were doing something quieter, something rarely seen in the age of noise. They were listening. And when a country listens long enough to those it once forgot, something starts to change. The hearing room was different this time. Not larger, just more prepared, sharper, as if even the walls had heard what had been happening outside the Capitol. The media expected policy updates, maybe another sparring match between parties. They didn't expect a screen, wide, towering, and backlit, standing like a silent witness behind the witness table. Senators filed in one by one. Staffers whispered. The press positioned their cameras toward the podium, but kept stealing glances at the blank screen, white and waiting. And then J.D. Vance walked in. He wasn't flanked by staffers. He didn't bring charts or talking points. He wore a charcoal suit, no pin, no flashy tie, just an envelope in one hand and a clicker in the other. He took his seat without ceremony. Across the aisle, Cori Bush glanced up briefly, leaned back in her chair, then returned her attention to a note card. The committee chair adjusted the mic. "Senator Vance, you have the floor." J.D. stood. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't smile. He simply pressed the clicker once. The screen behind him went black. Then slowly a name appeared, Elwood, Indiana. Below it, a faded photograph of the factory gates. Beneath that, closed 2009, 740 jobs lost. At the bottom, suicide rate rose 31% in the 3 years following. Another click. Lisbon, Ohio, a church steeple, an empty diner. Closed 2014, 622 jobs lost, largest opioid spike in the county's recorded history. Click. Ashland, Kentucky. A photo of the Little League team, 1996. Smiling kids in worn uniforms. Closed 2006 to 930 jobs lost. By 2010, 1 in 4 children living below the poverty line. The screen kept fading in and out, one town after another. No graphs, no red-blue analysis. Just names, photos, closures, numbers, reality. The room grew still. Even the rustling of paper stopped. After the 12th slide, J.D. spoke. His voice didn't rise. It didn't waver. It carried because it didn't try to perform. They say I'm romanticizing towns that should have moved on. They say these are old problems, that this is nostalgia. He clicked again. Paducah, Kentucky. Closed 2015, 570 jobs, lost a 14-year-old, hanged himself in his garage 2 months later. JD let the silence return, then said, "If these lives don't matter, prove it." No one interrupted. Prove it by saying them out loud. Prove it by going there, by walking into a grocery store where half the shelves are empty. Prove it by telling their kids it's their fault for being born in the wrong zip code. Another click. Crossett, Arkansas. An aerial shot of a plant mid-demolition. Closed 2019. 800 jobs, local water deemed contaminated 3 years later. JD turned to face the panel. "I'm not asking for applause. I'm asking for acknowledgement." Cori shifted in her chair. Someone coughed in the gallery, as if trying to break a spell. No one laughed. No one shouted him down, because the weight in the room was no longer his. It belonged to the names on the screen, to the faces in those photographs. He didn't offer a proposal, no 300-page bill, no viral soundbite, just one final line. "If remembering people is a weakness, then I hope I never grow strong." And with that, he sat. The screen behind him remained glowing, still showing the last name, Messina, New York. The cameras kept rolling, but the commentary stopped. Because for the first time in years, a Senate hearing ended not with noise, but with stillness. And in that stillness, something broke. Not a rule, not a party, but the idea that forgetting was ever neutral. By morning, no one could pretend it hadn't happened. News anchors hesitated, just slightly, before they moved on from celebrity headlines. Panels of political analysts, usually so quick with punchlines, now found themselves reaching for something deeper or fumbling in silence altogether. JD's display, town by town, story by story, had left a mark. No flash, no fireworks, just grief made visible, and no one could look away. At a major cable network, the host opened her segment with a rare note of candor. "We cover 100 headlines a week. This one might be the only thing that matters." On another station, a younger anchor choked up reading the suicide rate from Elmore, Indiana. 4 in one family, he said, voice catching. They called it a quiet winter. Online, the reactions were less polished but more telling. Reddit threads filled with confessions. "That map? That was my dad's town." One user wrote, "I thought I hated that guy, but he's right. We forgot." Even Cori Bush's supporters began to shift uncomfortably. The clip of her mocking JD's bill started to look less like righteous fire and more like something else. Dismissive, even cruel. In a political group chat that had once cheered her zinger, someone typed, "Not a good look anymore." No one responded. Meanwhile, JD didn't gloat. He didn't post memes or retweet praise. Instead, his team shared a single image, the full map, now dotted with gold, red, blue, and black pins. Underneath, the caption, "We didn't name them all. We just started to." And then came the unexpected voice. In a Sunday op-ed for a progressive outlet, columnist Lila Renner, longtime critic of J.D. Vance, penned a column titled, "Presence Isn't Partisan." Her piece read in part, "I still disagree with J.D. Vance on many things, but yesterday I watched him do something no one else in the room dared. He showed up for people whose names weren't trending. This wasn't about optics. It wasn't even about policy. It was about presence. And presence, when done honestly, doesn't belong to any party. It belongs to the people." The article exploded. It was shared by veterans groups, parent forums, even by labor organizers who once called JD a fraud. Cori Bush's team went quiet. One aide allegedly suggested doubling down, but another warned, "We'll lose the narrative. The ground is moving." Because it was. Slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. In Missouri, a former Democrat mayor posted a thread about his town's paper mill, how it closed in 2009, and no one ever came to ask why. He ended with, "I'm not voting red. I'm not voting blue. I'm voting for whoever doesn't laugh." In Ohio, a conservative farmer shared a clip of JD's Senate display and wrote, "For once, someone didn't blame us. He just heard us." The shift wasn't seismic, but it didn't have to be. A new coalition was forming, not around ideology, but around memory, around the audacity to say, these people matter. And JD, still silent on social media, just kept reading letters, just kept adding pins, just kept showing up. The Capitol felt different, not louder, not quieter, just altered. Cori Bush hadn't spoken publicly in days. No statements, no tweets, no rebuttals on talk shows. Her office issued a brief press release reaffirming focus on equity and inclusion, but even her usual media allies left it untouched. The energy had shifted, and not in her favor. JD walked the halls like he always had, hands in his coat pockets, head slightly lowered, not looking for cameras. But this time, eyes followed him, some out of curiosity, some out of confusion. A few now out of something that resembled respect. Inside the chamber, another hearing began, something about trade tariffs and regional subsidies. It was dry, procedural, and hollow. Yet for the first time in recent memory, senators didn't scroll their phones or quietly exit through side doors. They were watching him. JD sat still for the first half hour, said nothing, just flipped through the pages of testimonies from towns like Claysville, Rome, and La Junta. He wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to win. He was still listening. A moment later, a Republican senator from Utah, an old-school figure long known for his detachment, leaned over and whispered, "That was the first hearing I actually listened to in 5 years." JD didn't flinch, just turned slightly, offered a faint smile, and murmured, "That makes one of us." It wasn't a jab. It wasn't cruel. It was the kind of honesty that lands heavier than outrage, the kind that holds a mirror and says, "You stopped listening long before I started speaking." A few seats down, another senator, this time a moderate from Pennsylvania, nodded slowly. He looked at the map JD had brought again, now displayed on a side monitor, slightly faded but still covered in pins. The silence in the room wasn't awkward anymore. It was reverent. Outside, staffers gathered near televisions in break rooms. Some watched without sound, reading the closed captions line by line. A young aide from Cori's team, eyes scanning JD's quiet presence on screen, whispered, "He's not loud, but he's still winning." Later that day, a Democratic congresswoman approached JD in the hallway. She didn't offer praise or apology, just said, "We forgot you were one of them." JD simply nodded. "I didn't." Word spread quickly after that. Committee clerks said attendance ticked up. A handful of offices requested printouts of the hearing transcript. Journalists began calling it the day the room stayed still. Cori remained off camera, but her silence grew heavier with each passing hour. It wasn't that she didn't have something to say. It was that, now, she didn't know how to say it without sounding smaller than the moment she had dismissed. Back in his office, JD added one more pin to the map, this one from a letter sent by a janitor in Cori's own district. It read, in part, "I know she didn't mean all of us, but it still felt like she did. Thank you for saying our names." JD placed that pin in black. No caption, no speech. Just presence. And on the floor of the Senate, for the first time in a long time, presence had cracked something deeper than party lines. It had stirred something long asleep, the possibility that someone might listen, not to respond, not to posture, but to remember. And in that small, hard-earned crack, something was beginning to grow. The morning began with routine chatter in the Senate courtyard. Press crews lined the outer railings, expecting another predictable event, talking points, banners, perhaps a few sound bites to cut and splice before lunch. No one expected what came next. The crowd turned when the first bus pulled up, then a second, then 5 more. No press releases had gone out. No camera crews had been invited. But from across the Rust Belt and Deep South, families had arrived, quiet, firm, and carrying something heavier than protest signs. They carried names. From Ohio, Michigan, Kentucky, Arkansas, Indiana, and West Virginia, they came with folded jackets, framed photographs, and memorial pins. Children held portraits of grandfathers in work boots. A woman from Flint wore her father's hard hat like a crown. Some walked in silence, others hummed the melody of an old Union song, and at the front of them all stood a mayor from a forgotten river town in Alabama. In his hands, a wooden plaque carved with one sentence: "They closed our mill, not our pride." Security froze. Senate aides whispered frantically, but J.D. Vance didn't. He stood at the edge of the courtyard, hands behind his back, saying nothing. As the group moved forward in an informal column, their voices remained low, but their presence thundered louder than any campaign speech. Someone tried to ask J.D. for a comment. He raised a hand, not to speak, but to invite silence, and then he stepped aside. One by one, they began to speak, not into microphones, but into still air that for once felt sacred. A young woman from Iowa. "My town was erased from the supply chain, then from the maps." A father from Kentucky. "They took the factory, then blamed us for needing help." A teenage boy, barely 15, held up a letter his mother wrote the day their town's plant shut down. His voice cracked. "She said, we didn't fail. They forgot us." Behind them, the plaque was placed upright on the marble steps, not nailed down, not secured, just standing, as if daring the wind to move it. A senator from the back tried to interrupt, something about order, decorum, schedule, but no one listened. Even the Capitol Guard stood still. Cori Bush was notably absent. The mayor who held the plaque finally stepped forward, his voice the only one that carried fully across the courtyard. "We didn't come here to cheer for JD. We came because he remembered we exist. That's more than we can say for most of you." He looked out toward the cameras now being hastily unpacked by stunned crews and added, "You told us to write letters. We did. You told us to vote. We did. You told us to be patient. We were. And still, here we are, standing where no one wanted us." His eyes met JD's. No handshake, no staged embrace, just a nod. JD nodded back. No words, just wait, just truth. And as the press finally caught up, mics scrambling, boom poles dipping, the families had already begun to disperse, not leaving in protest, just finished. Later that evening, the plaque appeared online in a grainy photo with no watermark. A single caption read, "This wasn't organized. It was remembered." And under it, comments began to flood in. Not about party, not about polls, just names, towns, years, fathers, daughters, mills, mines. Silence. A movement didn't announce itself that day. It arrived. And JD, for all his planning and policy drafts, had done the one thing no committee could. He made room for others to speak, and then got out of the way. The bill looked different this time, not in structure, but in soul. It wasn't called Save Our Towns anymore. That name had served its purpose, stirred its controversy, weathered its ridicule. Now it bore a quieter, heavier name, the Dignity Act. J.D. Vance sat at his desk past midnight, red pen in hand, not editing but underlining. Beneath each section of policy language about tax credits for small-town startups, emergency health access in rural zones, and grants for technical retraining, were direct lines, word for word, from the letters that had poured into his office. He had asked his staff to stop paraphrasing. No summaries, no filters, just the raw, unslicked truth from the people who'd written it. A section about housing credits for counties with shuttered factories included a quote from Marlene's letter. "We don't want pity checks, we want sidewalks without cracks." A line about broadband access in coal country came from a 14-year-old who'd mailed in her college rejection letter, scribbled with, "They told me I needed more connection, so I'm trying to get it here." One policy note about small-town PTSD treatment read, "My husband came back from war and walked straight into unemployment. The silence is what broke him." Each citation was followed by initials and town names. No titles, no degrees, no affiliations. Just Americans whose dignity had gone unlegislated for too long. J.D. reviewed the draft again, slower this time, not for legal language, for tone. Was it too clean? Too polished? He didn't want polish. He wanted weight, not the kind that sinks, but the kind that holds a place in memory. By morning, he had printed 3 copies, one for the committee, one for the press, and one he folded neatly into a manila envelope, addressed in his own handwriting to Office of Representative Cori Bush, United States House of Representatives, Washington, D.C. He didn't seal it right away. Instead, he reached into his drawer, pulled out a yellow sticky note, and wrote just one sentence. From the towns you laughed at. He placed it on the cover page of the bill. No signature, no sarcasm, no threat. Just return fire in a language she'd once called performative policy. He walked the envelope to the courier desk himself. No cameras, no interns, just him. He handed it to the young man behind the counter and said, "No rush, but don't lose it." Back in his office, the digital copy of the bill was already circulating through Senate inboxes. The press didn't know what to make of it yet. No soundbite, no scandal, just legislation, with lines that read more like memory than legal code. Later that afternoon, a producer from a national outlet emailed JD's comms director, "This reads like poetry. Is that the angle?" The reply was short, "No, that's just how they wrote it." No response came from Cori's office. Not that day, not the next. But on a quiet evening later that week, her name appeared in the digital tracker of the bill's reading history. She'd opened it, scrolled through it, page by page, and paused longest on the part where a factory widow wrote, "I'm not asking you to fix everything. Just don't forget we were here." The tracker didn't show who reread it twice, but someone did. And outside the building where senators debated and strategized, the towns JD had spoken for were still waiting, not for rescue, not for revenge, but for something rarer, to be read and remembered. At a university auditorium in Missouri, the lights dimmed just enough to blur expressions, but not intentions. Cori Bush stood at the podium, eyes skimming a room full of political science students, local activists, and a handful of media stragglers who hadn't expected her to say much. For days, she'd been silent. The clip from the Senate, the map of names, the bill now branded the Dignity Act. It had all unraveled too quickly and too powerfully. She gripped the sides of the lectern, not out of fear, but out of something rarer. Awareness. "I want to say something I should have said months ago," she began, her voice steady but stripped of flair. "I forgot something. Not facts, not policies, but something deeper. I forgot humility." There was a pause. A few pens stopped scribbling. Some leaned forward. "I let a soundbite speak louder than a town. I confused attention with advocacy. And in doing so, I disrespected people whose pain I didn't take the time to understand." In the fourth row, a young woman stood and walked out. Two others followed, but others stayed. Some clapped, hesitantly at first, then firmer. Cori inhaled as if trying to make room for a truth that had waited too long. "Whether you believe I mean it or not isn't up to me anymore. But maybe, just maybe, it's not too late to listen." Outside the auditorium, the headlines wouldn't scream her change of tone. The social feeds wouldn't erupt. But something else had begun. A slow shift, not just in how she was seen, but in how she was seeing. The damage was real. The wounds were public, but so was the silence that followed, and in it, something unspoken moved. It stood in a clearing near the old railway tracks, once the industrial spine of southern Ohio. The structure wasn't tall, wasn't ornate, just a long, curved wall of brushed steel, glinting softly under a gray sky. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a windbreak. But up close, the names revealed themselves, etched into the metal without fanfare. 100 towns, no plaques, no slogans, just names. The towns weren't famous. Most had been forgotten by census records and election maps. Places like Millfield, Steubenville, Grundy, and Danville. Each name was spaced evenly, measured with care, forming a quiet constellation across the steel. The crowd was modest. Locals came in flannel jackets and worn ball caps. Children pointed, asking their parents, "Wasn't Grandpa from here?" No one gave speeches. There were no microphones, no ribbon cutting. Only a bell that rang once at noon, then fell silent. JD arrived without warning. No staff, no camera crew. Just a long coat and gloves that still smelled faintly of paper and ink. He stood at the very back, watching a girl trace the name Ironton with her mittened hand. A man beside him whispered, "That your work?" JD didn't answer. He just kept looking forward. A breeze rustled through the valley, nudging a few fallen leaves across the base of the wall. The steel didn't shine like gold. It didn't need to. It held something stronger, memory without vanity. As the crowd slowly thinned, JD approached the wall. He placed a single red pin beneath one name, Chillicothe. Then he turned and walked away, unnoticed by most, but not by all. That evening, back in his office, JD opened an envelope postmarked from Pike County. The handwriting was familiar, unsteady but deliberate. It was from Marlene. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. No extras, no second thoughts. "Dear Senator Vance, I watched the hearing, and the screen, and the wall. You said his name. You didn't flinch when you did it. That was all I ever wanted. For the first time since he left, I slept through the night. Tell the next mother, I heard her." Marlene? JD held the letter for a long while, rereading the final sentence until it blurred. The next morning, he returned to the wall of steel before the crowd arrived. The wind was sharper now, carrying the bite of a late Ohio fall. He knelt beside the base of the structure and, with gloved hands, opened a small glass panel embedded at the far right end. Inside was a shadow box, empty until now. He placed Marlene's letter inside, sealed it gently behind the glass. Above it, in plain lettering, a simple engraving read, "Letters that were answered." He stood back and took a breath, not of triumph, but of stillness. The kind that comes when something painful has found its place. Then he left. No photos, no press release, just the hum of steel holding names that might have otherwise been lost. The wind was soft that morning, carrying with it the kind of quiet that doesn't ask for attention, but earns it. A group of fourth graders stood before the wall, their teacher pointing gently at the names etched into the steel. The sun reflected off the brushed metal, casting faint halos over each letter. Some of the kids tilted their heads, whispering the names as if reading them aloud gave them weight. One boy, freckled, with a ball cap too large for his head, raised his hand. "Why are these names here?" he asked. The teacher didn't answer right away. She glanced behind the group, catching the presence of a man standing far off under the trees. JD Vance, in a dark coat, hands clasped in front of him, didn't move. He hadn't planned to be noticed. The teacher turned back to the class. "Because someone remembered," she said simply. "And when someone remembers, someone matters." A girl tugged at her sleeve. "But were they famous?" "No," the teacher said. "They were forgotten, until they weren't." The class went quiet. No one shuffled. No one scrolled a screen. Just the slow, steady sound of wind pressing through the trees, through memory. Behind the glass, near the center of the wall, a letter rested on display. Its folds were worn, its handwriting elegant but trembling. It was from Marlene, addressed to no one in particular, signed only his mother. And beneath her closing line, "You said his name. That was all I ever wanted." JD had written a final note in pen. He mattered. As the tour group slowly drifted toward their bus, JD remained still, eyes on the wall. He didn't take a photo. He didn't speak. Only one final voiceover, left for those who'd follow. She called it a stunt, but it became a vow. This story isn't just about politics, it's about presence. It reminds us that not every fight is won with noise. Sometimes dignity speaks louder in silence. JD didn't respond with outrage or spectacle. He responded with memory, with names, with places most of America had already forgotten. And through that, he reminded us of something deeply human. People don't disappear when factories close, or when the headlines move on. They remain. Their stories matter, not because they shout, but because they endure. Cori called it a stunt. But when communities saw their names on that steel wall, it didn't feel like performance. It felt like healing. Maybe legacy isn't what you build. Maybe it's who you choose not to erase. What's one forgotten name or place you think deserves to be remembered? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.